Welcome to China in Context from the SOAS China Institute at the University of London. I'm Duncan Hewitt. In this special episode, we're looking at the work and legacy of one of the most imaginative writers in English about modern China, and particularly Shanghai, Lynn Pan, or Panling, who died last year and was this week commemorated at a special event at the Hong Kong International Literary Festival. Lynn Pan was born in 1945 in Shanghai, a city which her grandfather, a construction tycoon, helped to build. But she had to leave China with her family in the early 1950s, moving first to what was then British North Borneo and later studying at London and Cambridge universities. In the early 1980s, as a journalist in Hong Kong, she began returning to China, producing the first of several deeply researched books on Shanghai in its pre-revolutionary heyday, In Search of Old Shanghai, which was soon followed by Old Shanghai, Gangsters in Paradise. She also wrote a book of reportage on 1980s China and a groundbreaking history of the Chinese diaspora, Sons of the Yellow Emperor, which won the Martin Luther King Memorial Prize. In the 1990s, she finally moved back to Shanghai, where she wrote her definitive work on the city, Shanghai Style, and also her last book, When True Love Came to China, a fascinating portrait of attitudes to marriage and romance in the 1920s and 30s. The breadth of her interests was matched by the elegance of her writing and by her personal wit, charm and grace. So to talk about Lynn Pan and her legacy, I'm joined by two of the speakers at this week's memorial event in Hong Kong. Paul French, author of several books on pre-revolutionary China, including Midnight in Peking, City of Devils, and most recently Her Lotus Year, the story of Wallis Simpson, the Duchess of Windsor's time in China. And Michel Garneau, founder of the legendary Shanghai restaurant M on the Bund, and also of the Shanghai Literary Festival, at which Lynn Pan spoke many times. We're also joined by Lynn's old friend Dr. Francis Wood, former curator of the Chinese collections at the British Library and a research associate here at SOAS. But first, a few words on Lynn Pan from Jeffrey Wasserstrom, Professor of Modern Chinese History at the University of California, Irvine, and author of the book Global Shanghai 1850 to 2010, who was one of many writers and researchers who benefited from Lynn Pan's advice and inspiration.
Lynn was somebody I learned an enormous amount from, and she was one of my favorite people to talk to about Shanghai history. She wanted to get things right about Shanghai and convey it in an accessible and entertaining way. And if you shared that interest with her, both about the facts and about caring about your writing, she was incredibly generous and supportive. I wasn't the only academic who took her writing in a popular vein very seriously. My advisor, Fred Wakeman, was really charmed by her work on Gangsters in Paradise, even when he was working on a similar topic. So there were books that were based on careful research that I learned a lot from. But ironically, because Lynn was a quite private person, one of the books that I found most intriguing was her most personal book, Tracing It Home, which could be described as a memoir, but it could also be called a family history. And my favorite part of that book, and the part that I think about most now as I think about the dilemmas that people are facing in Hong Kong, is the part where she talks about what happened when Shanghai was taken over by the Chinese Communist Party in 1949. And a lot of families, including her own, were kind of divided about whether to stay and welcome the change or whether to leave. So there's a wonderful part in it where she talks about the difficult choice that was made eventually to leave in the 1950s. And she describes, and her language is beautiful, so I encourage everybody to read it, but she talked about a kind of kaleidoscopic Shanghai, a Shanghai of many parts disappearing and a more monochromatic Shanghai taking its place. And then, of course, much to her own surprise, she ended up feeling that for a time she could go back to Shanghai, that there was again, even if still under Communist Party rule, there was enough of that kind of a kaleidoscopic Shanghai of many parts to live there again.
Well, that was Professor Jeffrey Wasserstrom. Now, Michelle Garneau, you knew Lynn Pan for several decades, and you've just organised this commemoration for her in Hong Kong. And I think you also want to read a couple of extracts that you read there. But what does her work mean to you?
Well, I told this story yesterday when I first went to Shanghai in the mid 80s. I think it was maybe about 84, 85. And I was staying at the Conservatory of Music with people who were studying there and living there. And the book that everybody had, I mean, the only book that everybody had was Lynn's In Search of Old Shanghai. So I think it's probably the first time that I saw it. And it was sort of like a guidebook because, anything else was really published probably pre-49. So I think that book was, really a seminal, groundbreaking book. And I will read a little bit from the introduction because it puts us right back in that spot, just the color. And we were all reminded when I read this little bit yesterday, what a fantastic writer she was on top of everything. I mean, the quality of her writing is just so beautiful. And she just brings the whole place to life.
So you wanted to read a little extract from In Search of Old Shanghai, which is the book that Lynn published in 1982, very soon after she had been able to go back to Shanghai for the first time, which was in 1981, after 3 decades. And she really, as you say, almost invented a genre of writing about old Shanghai, which now is a huge genre. And there are so many writers who write books either about characters from Shanghai in the 1920s and 30s, or try to write sort of comprehensive studies of that era. But Lynn very much was the first in the sort of post-communist revolutionary era.
Yes, she was. And it's just so clear in its description and just transports you back there instantly. Okay, so much of the fascination of life in Shanghai in the decades before the 1949 liberation lies in its strange remoteness from the world of China today, 1981. Strange that so contemporary an experience can vanish so completely. The street names changed, the capital has fled, the glory's gone, the glitter faded, the foreign residents chased out of town, the bubble burst. It was only yesterday, after all, that Shanghai was the Paris of the East, the capital of the tycoon, the whore of Asia, and the paradise of adventurers, where missionaries declared that if God let Shanghai endure, he owed an apology to Sodom and Gomorrah. Today, Shanghai is neither modern nor great, least of all is it cosmopolitan. On seeing the city again, those who knew it in its heyday are inescapably saddened. Their hearts still grieve to see the once gleaming walls blackened and blotched, the ironwork ripped out or rusted, the elegant boulevards pitted with potholes. Other eyes look back as hazily, misty with the romance of proletarian degradation and revolution. In each view, nostalgia has refracted the image, and the good old days seem infinitely better than they were. But when each adjusts its fancies to the facts, then it is bound to see that the world of old Shanghai could not possibly have endured, and to concur with God and the missionaries that it was time it went when it did.
Well, that very much sums up this, rather elegiac quality of what she wrote. But she also, I think, as Paul, you have suggested, she really tried to bring to life the characters in that city, both in that first book, In Search of Old Shanghai, where she already talks about some of the key people she carried on to write about in a later book called Old Shanghai Gangsters in Paradise. And the title of that book in itself tells you a little bit about her, her ability to convey the excitement and the fascination that she felt for this topic. She talks about Du Yuesheng, the famous gangster, about both his nefariousness, but also the fact that the people of Shanghai admired him in many ways. And she has an interesting sort of summary of what Shanghai and its style was. She says sophistication with a touch of vulgarity was, of course, very much the Shanghai way. So tell us a bit about what it is that you see in her work and how it's influenced you, because you've written City of Devils, which is very much reimagining Shanghai in the 1930s and early 1940s as the Japanese took over parts of the city. And you say that Lynn had quite an influence on your own writing.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, from that excerpt, you can tell that she had a great turn of phrase, and that idea of history being told with great narrative, but including anecdote and gossip and things like that, as well as good research. I mean, she was a great researcher, but she also enjoyed the gossip and the anecdotes, I think, and saw that there was a role for those. But always, as well, one thing that I found very inspirational, and it's quite hard to do, is, she has a great aesthetic sensibility that she weaves through everything as well, and of course later on she did books, Shanghai style, and there are some more sort of photographic art style books that reflect that. And so the idea that you come to write about place, you come to write about a city by looking at old photographs and looking at old buildings and old architectural plans, as well as reading old academic papers, is sort of interesting. I first met her, actually, I can't remember what the event was, but it was somewhere in Shanghai. And a German businessman was mansplaining the current state of the world to the two of us. And he said, well, the problem now is that nobody reads newspapers. And Lynn just looked at him and said, well, I still read newspapers every day. It's just that they were all published in 1936. And so that also that immersion in the subject, that Lynn was this sort of synthesis of Shanghai, a great appreciation and study of Shanghai Hua, the local dialect language, wherever we are on that debate at the moment. Chinese literature, of course, I think she first introduced me to Mu Shiying. Of course, she was a great lover of Zhang Eileen Chang as well. But she introduced me to sort of, those 1930s Shanghai short story writers, most of whom have been written out of the canon because they all sort of went with Wang Jingwei. And one of the things about Gangsters in Paradise is I'd never read a book that ever mentioned Wang Jingwei before when I read that.
So who was the head of the puppet government under the Japanese?
Yeah, the collaborator with the Japanese.
During the war years.
That was a kind of fascinating element to the story that no one wanted to take on in China. Most Western academics didn't bother with.
So in that book, the two main characters were Du Yuesheng, the head of the Green Gang, this notorious sort of racketeering gang which controlled enormous amounts of Shanghai and the way that the city functioned, and was at times called on by the Kuomintang to put down communist uprisings and things like that. And then she wrote about, as you say, the head of the puppet government, Wang Jingwei, who, as indeed had been very much written out of history and still is, I think, in China itself today. But she writes about him as this, she calls him a sad but beguiling individual, and I think was really quite fascinated by his sort of tragic story of starting off as a real patriot. He'd even been an early member of the Communist Party and then moved.
Yeah, he was the left-wing candidate against Chiang Kai-shek.
Moved to the nationalist government, then felt frustrated with Chiang Kai-shek, thought he could save China, but thought he could do that with the Japanese. But in that book, she also writes a lot about Eileen Chang, who you mentioned, Zhang Eiling, the writer whose books have been more widely translated recently, and whose work was adapted into films such as Lust Caution, directed by Ang Lee. But again, I think we could probably say that as well as more or less pioneering this genre of writing about old Shanghai, she very much was one of the first people to write about the importance of Eileen Chang as a writer, which I think is something that's now widely acknowledged, that she really was one of the great Chinese writers of the 20th century, and of course wrote in English sometimes as well.
And I think she was way ahead of her time in terms of we spoke yesterday quite a lot with the other speaker, Carolina, about when Love Came to China, which was sort of Lynn's last paper, which comes from Eileen Chang's short story. But although she was writing about old Shanghai, this nostalgia was rooted in the very important idea that sort of stated in When Love Comes to China, but is in Gangsters in Paradise, is in Search of Old Shanghai. It's in all of her work. That Shanghai was a crucible of modernism, and that certainly was very influential on me. And I think lots of people, who thought modernism was just the Bloomsbury lot and Joyce, and in America Fitzgerald and Dos Passos or whatever, but she really made the case. Nowadays, of course, lots of work has been done on the role of Shanghai and China in a wider sense, in terms of being part of a global modernisms, as they say, right? The work that Lu Xun and Mu Shiying and lots of other writers through to Eileen Chang were doing is a part of global modernism, as was what was happening at the Shanghai Art Academy, as was what was happening with typography and magazine production and the movie business and all sorts of things, right? And that goes all through her work. And she was saying that at a time when we didn't even have the terminology to really talk about global modernisms and everything. She was way ahead on that. I mean, I will just say, if you go back to Gangsters in Paradise, this idea that she sort of reintroduced literary nonfiction as a great way of telling Shanghai stories, which I think is kind of essential in a sense that so much in Shanghai is a little bit underworldy. Business transactions were often, you know, just whispered, and it was done on a handshake, right? Gangsters are gangsters. The politics was underground. The Communist Party politics at the time was completely underground, right? You know, what went on with the Wang Jingwei administration was not really recorded in any great detail. The Japanese occupation and so on. So that makes it a problem for academics that need to do a lot of footnoting and sourcing. But she says at the start of Gangsters in Paradise, she says, all the people and places in this book are real, but the final image which they have in it, drawn from the array of historical facts, biographies, memoir, quotations, and reminiscences which constitute its source, is necessarily colored by my own interpretation. Although as a reconstruction of historical figures and their times, the book borders on fiction, I've made an effort to adhere closely to the historical evidence. But where it has been necessary to choose between what history tells me in the way of facts and what it points to in the way of psychological reality, I have often chosen the latter. In all cases, though, I have tried to do so with good reason. If in some scenes my reconstruction is not true in every detail of objective reality, I believe it to be true in the atmosphere and feeling, right? And this notion of atmosphere, which I think is crucial to literary nonfiction. And, you know, Shanghai has more atmosphere than most places, right? Particularly at that time, is kind of so important. And then she gives us the genesis of the book. She says, the book had its germ in a trip I made to Shanghai in 1981. There, as a guest at a banquet, I found myself sitting next to a man addressed by those present as Papa Du, and discovered that he was none other than Du Yuesheng, or Big-Eared Du, the boss of the Green Gang, his son. It was evident that he was a man with clout, and this despite his father's role in the slaughter of the communists in 1927 and afterwards. Paradox and tactically mobile loyalties, it seems, are ever endemic to the communist state, as they were indeed, of course, to the nationalist state, when Papa Du was made head of the Opium Suppression Commission, while at the same time being the largest opium dealer in the world. So that's the kind of contradictions you have. And I think that's where she realizes that Shanghai is not really going to give you the straight telling of history. It's always going to keep things covered up. It's never going to reveal itself completely. You've got to kind of work around it.
Yeah, I think as she notes in In Search of Old Shanghai, her mother's family, who were a very sort of respectable banking family who had come to Shanghai from Ningbo, nevertheless were actually connected to the likes of Du Yuesheng. She said that her grandmother, that most upright and virtuous of creatures, was a frequent guest at Du Yuesheng's opera soirees because the leader of the Green Gang had married two famous opera singers. And she talks about how, you know, Shanghai high society was what she describes it as being inseparable from the greed, the lawlessness, the vulgarity, the swank, and the bizarreness of this unique city. Lynn also wrote the book, which really did explain her family background and also told a lot about her own life and her journey sort of back to China, because actually she left Shanghai when she was, I think, around 8 years old. It's slightly vague. She stayed on after the Communist Revolution when her parents had initially gone to Hong Kong, and then eventually they came back and took her in the end to British North Borneo, which now is part of Malaysia. But Francis Wood, you've known Lynn, I think you knew Lynn for half a century, and you've read all her books, and you also had, I think, quite a lot to say about that memoir, which is called Tracing It Home, Journeys Around a Chinese Family. And it's also a very unusual book, which really epitomizes Lynn, I think, as a writer.
Yes, I mean, it's lovely for me, though, to listen to you talking about her and Shanghai, because if I think about her now, what I want to remember is how when she was happiest, which was when she was in Shanghai. Yeah. You know, I knew her from the 70s onwards, and she had a flat just literally up the road from me, 1 block up. But she was really looking for where she could live and where she could be happy. And it wasn't until she was able to go back to Shanghai properly and live first in Pudong and then in that wonderful flat in the centre of town, which was where I first met Paul. But I mean, to go back to tracing it back home, I mean, that starts with the difficulty of her getting back to China because of worrying about getting a proper British passport because everything was so uncertain in those days.
Because you met her when she had moved to the UK after finishing her school, and she went to university in London.
Right.
And she studied psychology, actually. And she then worked for a while in this sort of area of psychopharmacology, I think it's called, and was involved in a book that critiqued the international response to the control of drugs and alcohol, particularly in places in Africa. And this was, again, a sort of partly colonial history, but partly contemporary policy. So she had this incredibly broad knowledge and ability to understand the world. But she then decided to go back to study Chinese, and she went to Cambridge University for 2 years, where she sort of joined the degree halfway through. And you knew her around that time. And then on graduation in the late 1970s, she obviously was very keen, as you suggest, to find a way back to Asia and ultimately, clearly, to Shanghai.
Yes, yes. I mean, for herself visiting Shanghai again, but then she went to work in Hong Kong and then went to work in Singapore, and she was always getting closer, as it were. But it was getting closer to China, and it was Shanghai that she really needed to be in. She was always working toward it. It's quite funny when you raise the pharmacology stuff, because in When True Love Came to China, which is the most extraordinarily, brilliantly researched book, I mean, covers everything from sort of Plutarch and the Shi Jing. She also has got a long section on the kind of chemical effects of love, which is rather good. And she was so well read, and she researched so well. But again, it was, I think, the discovery of Shanghai Library, again, was one of the great moments for her. She did research when she was here, in all the obvious places, SOAS and British Library. But she adored Shanghai Library, and that was a huge discovery for her.
And there's a story, actually,
Yes.
by Professor Jeffrey Wasserstrom said that he once met her and asked her what she'd been doing recently. And she said, "Oh, I've been researching how people in Shanghai felt about the death of Stalin." And he said, "Oh, are you writing a book on this, or are you doing an article?" And she said, "Oh, no, I just wanted to know. So I've been reading old newspapers in the Shanghai Library, and now I think I understand." That for her, that was enough, that she would go back into these sources. And of course, the great thing was that she was so completely bilingual, as well as speaking Shanghai dialect in a way that, not that many people speak it anymore, in this very classic sort of older way, which I think a lot of people also respected. But as you say, she came back to Asia initially in the late 1970s as a journalist, and she worked for a magazine called Asia Week, and she then joined the old Far Eastern Economic Review, which was a very influential publication. And that, I think, enabled her to do quite a lot of traveling around China. And in the 1980s, I think a lot of people forget, she wrote quite an influential book about the social change that was happening in China at that time, in the early reform period. And that was called The New Chinese Revolution, which I remember reading when I was a student of Chinese. But Francis, I think you think that this book is also quite worthy of being better remembered, or more widely remembered.
Maybe that's my own sort of sentimentality, in the sense that it describes very much the period of opening up, the full modernization, things that those of us who were in China in the late 70s and early 80s would know terribly well. But I think rereading it, I picked it up again and I thought, gosh, it's going to be so old hat, it's going to be about nothing. But it so much contains a huge amount of what is still happening in China, and what is absolutely, part of today, even though it looks as if it's yesterday. And there's a wonderful bit in it that I enjoyed a great deal, which shows again how Lynn could say things that none of the rest of us can, really, with great delicacy and ease. And she talks about being in Geneva. She was in Geneva for some kind of chemical meeting. It's 1972. A year after China was readmitted to the United Nations. She's in Geneva as a UN, as it were, employee or part of their thing. And she was set upon, seized by Chinese members of the Chinese delegation. And they want to know, does she speak Chinese? Invite her for a cup of tea, sit down. They just then explained that they couldn't understand a word of what was going on, not the language really, as much as the proceedings. And she says, the way these delegates sought my advice in Geneva was indicative, I thought, of the inherited Chinese habit of trusting only those that they see as their own kind. It did not matter to them that the people I worked for were European, or that the passport I held was foreign. By birth and descent, I was Chinese, and this was enough reason for them to trust me. A Chinese weakness is they're not naturally at ease with foreigners. It's an old weakness, manifesting itself sometimes in haughtiness, sometimes in xenophobia and inwardness of their foreign policy, as when they befriended almost no nation except Albania, which is again something that I can remember very well. And that's something that it's kind of quite a delicate area to talk about. But of course, Lynn could do it. She could, with great respect, as it were, for both sides, she could introduce ideas that other people would find it difficult to say. And of course, she was this fantastic bridge. I mean, she did it for us. You know, she explained what was going on for her friends and her readers. I mean, she was amazing because, again, I was just saying about the first time I met Paul was in her flat in Shanghai, and Jeff Wasserstrom was there, and it was the first time I'd met him. I mean, she was a great bridge maker. She liked bringing people together, and she wanted to hear what they had to say. She wanted to learn from them. She was a wonderful go-between. I mean, a very exceptional character in that sort of, that she absorbed and then she put it out and gave us sort of so much information. And this new Chinese revolution is really kind of still very kind of key to how China behaves now, I think.
And it's interesting that you describe her as that kind of a bridge. I mean, you know, obviously there's that kind of East meets West cliche is overused, but clearly Lynn was someone who could operate absolutely on both sides of that line. And I was struck by a description that she gave when she was writing about Eileen Chang, the novelist Zhang Eiling, and she described her as emotionally Shanghainese and culturally cosmopolitan in a way that only natives of that city could be, gaining other identities without debasing one's own. And I actually think that would be a very good description of Lynn Pan herself. Yeah. And she actually drew on her own great, you know, fascination for Chinese culture and history when she wrote a book called Sons of the Yellow Emperor about the overseas Chinese and their history and the diaspora and how it had spread around the world, based on her own really quite deep knowledge of Chinese culture and history. And that book, again, was very influential, I believe.
Yeah, I think hugely. And what was so wonderful about her, again, was that she was a very particular sort of overseas Chinese, if you like, you know, with that strong consciousness of Shanghai, her own background, her own family. But she embarked upon huge travels, going all the way around the sort of Toisan area in Guangdong, which is kind of very different, very much not her own sort of native place. But she took it tremendously seriously, I think.
Because this was one of the places in Guangdong where a lot of the earlier emigres had gone to the US and to the West.
Yeah, but I think it, you know, it kind of added on. In that period when she was first able to go back to China, I mean, she did travel very widely, and that all, of course, informed what she was doing. It wasn't all books. She was a fantastic book researcher, but also when she was younger, I mean, more recently, she was very frail, and it was more difficult for her to travel, although she was still pretty indomitable. I mean, she'd go anywhere to hear Jonas Kaufman. I mean, no matter climb any mountain. But
the opera singer who she loved so much, and along with her sister, they both would go to see him in Munich or wherever.
But I think Duncan, that shows that just how essentially Shanghai she was, how hi-fi, you know, East-West fusion was. She was. I know for a long time, I don't think it's never been published, unfortunately, but researching classical Chinese gardens. And I think I came across some blueprints of one of the old gardens of Shanghai and gave them to her, which she was very happy with. And in return, she spent sort of an hour trying to explain to me the Chinese appreciation of rocks in gardens, you know, this classical Chinese things and classical Chinese food and so on. But also there was Western opera, there were other things there. And, you know, I mean, you know, Michelle can say that when you did the Shanghai Literary Festival for so many years, you know, Lynn was pretty much in the front row early for everything.
She had that great interest, as you say, in almost anything that you could possibly mention. But I know, Michelle, that you said that Lynn would also always give you suggestions when it came to the Shanghai Literary Festival. And you said that she was one of the first people who spotted the talent maybe of the writer Liu Cixin, who wrote the Three-Body Problem and this great science fiction work. You know, again, something you wouldn't have expected her to be interested in.
It's true. She told me to read that book, and we tried and tried and tried to get him to come. But I've even got his mobile telephone number. You know, I dealt with him directly, but yeah, he wasn't having it.
Just to go back to the books, after doing that book in the early 90s on the overseas Chinese, which had quite a big impact. I mean, I've been told by academics that, you know, it inspired them to go and do their PhDs on aspects of overseas Chinese history. And again, we could say it almost launched a genre. And she was actually taken then, invited to go and work in Singapore, where she became the editor of the Encyclopedia of the Chinese Overseas at a Chinese Heritage Center in Singapore. So that was probably the most academic period of her life. But after that, she clearly wanted to then move back to Shanghai, and she embarked on an enormous amount of research in Shanghai, as you've all been saying, and actually then produced this great work called Shanghai Style, which is another remarkable assimilation of information from so many different sources that looks at the artists, the cartoonists, the designers, and writers, people who made Shanghai what it was through the media, through buildings, through fashion in the 1920s and 30s. And I believe that, Michelle, I mean, obviously launched that book at the Shanghai Literary Festival, and that's a book very close to your heart.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fabulous book, and it just covers so much, just everything, Shanghai Style, and in every aspect. So that's what's really remarkable about that book. And it's a really beautiful book too.
It's beautifully illustrated with
enormous
detail that, again,
detail. Exactly.
A knowledge of the media of Shanghai in that era, which is the source of a lot of the works, and also the modernist Chinese artists of that period, who are little known really outside China, although that's slowly changing.
It was also very much graphic style, wasn't it, Francis? I mean, the whole style was sort of what we would maybe call deco, but it was so strong, and it was also so individual, and so it was not like anything coming out of anywhere else. It belonged to Shanghai, and somehow it was a bit like the architecture of Shanghai. You know, it was just so completely different to European, Western, Eastern European architects, taking various elements of both Chinese architecture or Chinese typesetting and typography or character writing, and basically transferring those ideas into images.
And it really does kind of reinforce the importance of Shanghai. I mean, what you're coming back to, you know, Shanghai as this major city. I mean, and in the 20s and 30s, Peking didn't matter at all. You know, it had a kind of series of failing governments and parliaments and so on. Shanghai was really where everything was happening, and it's exemplified in design and in building and in creation. And, you know, the number of journals that were published in Shanghai at that time, absolutely massive, and all with these wonderful deco covers.
Paul, what do you think about that?
Well, I think
the significance of that book and the research she did?
Well, yes to everything everyone said. I mean, for me, part of it, again, going back to that idea of, you know, inserting Shanghai into the global modernism, right? The specificity and the general. Yes, it's an Art Deco building, but it's an Art Deco building with Shanghai characteristics, the Shanghai take on that, and that's really important. And also, which I think is really important for people that study Shanghai because of the nature of the place it was, the appreciation of things that are considered ephemeral by other people, you know, sort of throwaway movie fan magazines, or what used to be called the Mosquito Press, which just reported on who were the beauty queens and who was gangster of the month. I mean, I was researching a gangster recently, and there are these ephemeral magazines that I led to from some of Lynn's work that used to profile gangsters, but also advertising. You know, of course, in Shanghai, the calendar girls, you know, these are just adverts for companies making cotton thread or milk, condensed milk or whatever. That kind of throwaway stuff, a free calendar, a free handout. She saw those as integral to, you know, and now some of these things seem so obvious to us that Shanghai is part of global modernism, that if you're going to study art and design, you look at beer bottle labels or posters on public transport or whatever. But you know, it wasn't always so obvious. And again, Lynn, I think was a bit ahead of her time on that one.
And she then went on to carry out further in-depth research, particularly in Chinese literature, when she wrote what was to be her final book, which was called When True Love Came to China, which was really about how we could say Western notions of romantic love began to influence a younger generation in China in this period, in the 1920s and 30s, after the May the 4th movement, in 1919, of course. And she again displays an enormous sort of erudition. She talks also a lot here about Eileen Chang and her writing, which was very much about relationships. She looks at people like Lu Xun and their own relationships, but she's contrasting it with a sort of traditional Chinese attitude where people got married largely for family reasons or money or practical concerns. And that's also been quite groundbreaking, and an area where there's been a little scholarship, but not very much. But she brought it alive, and this is a book which is exhaustively researched and widely praised at the time.
The research is just extraordinary, and it points forward towards the plants and gardens area that she was going, because that's very much based in literature. What I like very much about it is to do a little bit with what Paul was saying, that she's interested in gossip and influence, and as she writes the book, there's a very solid sort of scientific and well-researched background. Then she comes to people who epitomize different aspects of writing about love. I mean, poets Yu Dafu and Hu Shi and so on, and kind of quite well-known characters. And you feel her real engagement with the people, with them as people, and of course Eileen Chang. So it moves from the kind of the general to very specific writing about people's lives and how they were affected. And it's you feel that she holds them very close, and it's their own stories, the way they wrote about them, and what they show about, particularly about the early 20s, the May the 4th and post period. And she's very engaged.
But isn't that one of her absolute talents, Frances, is to, wear her academic research so lightly that you don't feel it's academically, where a lot of people can't do that. You just feel that they wear this academic research so heavily, but she never did. You never felt anything was academic, and yet the academic research was so thorough.
Yeah.
And Frances, you mentioned this sort of last project that Lynn had embarked on before the pandemic, which was to look particularly into Chinese literature and art at the influence of plants and the sort of attitudes to gardens and how that affected Chinese society, and also China's links with the Western world when Western botanists started coming to China in the sort of 17th, 18th century, and how many plants, including very significantly, she said the Rosa chinensis, the roses, and so many other plants were exported from China to the West, and the impact that had on gardens and people's lives in the West. So again, this was really quite groundbreaking work, which she was doing also with her sister May Holdsworth, who's also a writer, but sadly they didn't bring this to fruition. But it was another sign. I went to a talk that Lynn gave on that research, and it was just so fascinating. It was also about the tea trade and the significance of different flowers in Chinese literature and what they symbolized as sort of emblems of love. So her wide knowledge, again, I think was leading into another new and interesting direction.
Yes, and I was just going to say, as Michelle said, her amazing gift for marrying research with people's stories would have been absolutely part of it.
I do know that Lynn actually finished, her part, because she did agree to do it with May. But May said that, the biggest problem would be actually getting all of the permissions for all these images from, paintings and from literature. And it would just be impossible to get the permission to actually print the images.
So, I mean, another example really of the kind of pioneering work that Lynn Pan did throughout her life. Can I just ask you all briefly, what do you think is her legacy in terms of research, of writing, of studies of China and Shanghai in particular?
Enormous, but needing to be uncovered again. It needs a new generation to see it. And unfortunately, with her dying, there might be a new generation.
But very much meriting further readership.
Absolutely. Very much meriting further readership. And I think, that will happen.
More now than ever, in a sense. I think I was saying yesterday that, one of the, apart from the idea of the global modernisms, the other thing that runs through Lynn's work all the time, and that is, something that's quite precious to me as an idea, but is sort of under attack pretty much everywhere at the moment, is cosmopolitanism. And all of her work was cosmopolitan because, of course, she was cosmopolitan, and the place she came from was cosmopolitan. Therefore, she understood that cosmopolitanism is one of the basic essences of creativity. So I think reading her work again now is quite important at this time when the ideas of cosmopolitanism and internationalism are so under attack.
One thing we didn't talk about is her humor and her cheekiness. There's so much sort of like little sneaky bits of cheekiness in the writing, which I just love because you can just see her with this tiny smirk on her face. And I think that's also a joy of reading her.
She had a very, very dry sense of humor, didn't she? Which people might not have immediately noticed, but her sense of sort of irony and satire was subtle but quite deep, I think.
It was subtle but deep, exactly. Sorry, Frances.
Well, I think some of the most sensitive and yet comprehensible books on China, and focusing particularly on Shanghai, on nostalgia for Shanghai. I think it's a huge legacy. Her books, they'll definitely survive as being vitally important for people who want to understand China. They'll definitely be read. And she's a terrific commentator and, as I say, a terrific bridge, an explainer, someone who makes Shanghai come alive to all of us.
And also still relevant. And I was reading China's Sorrows, which was written in, I think, 85, which is
a book about the Yellow River?
Yeah.
It's the one along the Yellow River. And even also just understanding, even if I've lived there for so long and you know so much about it, but I just learned new things, on every page, a better understanding of why China is like it is and how to sort of understand it in a very easy way, a very easy reading, but at the same time being intelligent and smart and enlightening.
Well, Michelle Garneau, Frances Wood and Paul French, thank you so much for joining us to pay tribute to Lynn Pan, a brilliant Shanghainese citizen of the world, as well as a fantastic writer and historian.
Thank you, Duncan.
Yes,
thank you, Duncan.
Well, that's all we have time for on this episode of China in Context. You can find information about events at the SOAS China Institute and read our blog on our website, soas.ac.uk. But for now, thanks for listening and goodbye.